Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we can give as much airtime to our speakers as possible and have some a nice allocation of time for question and answer. So I'm Heather Huff. I'm the Executive Director of PACE, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here today to talk about California's funding system and what it would take to get to a place where we're adequately funded. I think it's a very timely issue, and we have some really fantastic research coming out of Getting Down to Facts that will be the kind of front-leading piece of what we do today. So this, as you know, is part of a series of research that we've been presenting here in these seminars around Getting Down to Facts. Getting Down to Facts 2 is a collaborative research study. We brought together over 100 researchers from across the nation to take stock of where we're at as a state and what improvements we still need to make in pre-K through 12 education. The goal really being that we have this unique opportunity with the administration changing and all of the changes here in Sacramento to make research evidence the foundation of the plans and the paths that are laid forward for California. This was a sequel to the first Getting Down to Facts, which was released 10 years ago. Many credit that set of research studies for laying the groundwork for the policies that came under with the local control funding formula and the related policy structures. That set of studies really showed that our system of school finance was broken and needed a big overhaul. And so part of what this set of studies does is also look at the vast changes that have occurred in the system and be able to see what needs to happen next. So what did we learn? We looked at 4 areas of study in student success, governance, personnel, and finance. The group here today will be talking about finance, of course. Some of our key findings were that California schools and students have been moving in the right direction. These changes that we've put into place have resulted in some measurable change and also have very broad support from across the state. But we still need to do quite a bit of investment to address system weaknesses and capacity. Specifically, we need to build the structures that actually help to make these current reforms produce lasting change. We need to increase funding and fix systems, and we need to do all of this in the context of focusing very tightly on closing achievement gaps and advancing equity here in the state. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers very shortly, who are Jennifer Imazeki from San Diego State University, Jesse Levin from American Institutes for Research, and Ileana Brodziak de los Reyes from American Institutes for Research as well. And then we'll make sure that at the end of both of their presentations, we'll have time for Q&A, so save your questions and comments. And it's not just Q&A, but also discussion. So many of you in the room are working on this issue of funding adequacy very deeply yourselves. So bringing your experience into the room will be critically important in that end session. So without further ado, Jennifer.
Can I have the little clicker thing? Thanks. Okay, hello there, everybody. So there are other papers like Jesse and Ileana's that talk more and try to identify how much money we need. And as they're going to talk about in a minute, that's more than we currently have. Right? So what I was trying to do in my technical report was really look at the other 2 questions that go along with trying to get more money. Where would additional revenue come from? And how can we make sure that any additional revenue is allocated to districts as it needs to be in a way that makes sense? And so in large respect, my paper is fairly descriptive. There's a lot in it that I know a lot of folks in this room are already familiar with. I really tried to survey the literature that we know about adequacy and how much money different districts need and what kind of factors affect the amount of money that any individual district might need, but also to look at what other states are doing. Because for some of these questions, the research is actually pretty slim or is not conclusive in one way or the other. And then, again, where the money might come from. I try to kind of look at, again, what other states are doing. As I will talk about, and as most people in this room know, California's options for additional revenue are limited in ways that other states don't have. And so that's going to impact kind of how we think about that question. So one thing I always like to start out with is, we had this change to the local control funding formula, which, just to make sure everybody understands the way I'm talking about this, in the research we would talk about something like the LCFF as a weighted funding formula, right? So you have a base allocation, and then that is allocated to the districts on a per pupil basis, and that per pupil count is weighted for different student characteristics. So in California, switching from what we had before in terms of all the different categorical programs and revenue limits that made no sense and all that sort of thing, switching to the LCFF, which is very transparent, very simple in some regards to explain, that was revolutionary. I mean, it was huge, right? But other states in the country already do it this way and have been for a really long time. So from the perspective of the way school funding is allocated, the way state aid to districts is determined, a weighted funding formula is sort of the norm. It's used in the majority of other states. So we kind of got in line with everybody else. Because of that, we can look at what other folks are doing and how their formulas line up compared to ours, and how all of that lines up compared to what the research says we might need. So one thing I want to start out is by pointing out that the base level of funding in the local control funding formula that we have in California is higher than the base level in a lot of other states. But the LCFF only weights for a few things, right? We have the specific weights for poverty, English learners, and foster children. We have an additional allocation if that concentration of need is over a certain threshold. And I have grade level in there because technically the way we account for different grade levels in the LCFF is that the base amount is considered to be different for different grade levels, but that can be converted to an implicit weight. And that is also how it's done in a lot of other states, is that there's weights for earlier grades or high school or combinations thereof. So compared to other states, our formula is pretty simple. I like to point out that we went from having one of the most convoluted, complex, inefficient, not transparent systems to one of the simplest. And in fact, it's much simpler in that regard than most other states, because most other states have weights for many other characteristics besides just poverty and English learners. And so they're listed there. But when you put together the lower base weight in other states, but all of these other things, it turns out on average what our districts get in California is still lower than in most other states. And I'm going to be using the term other states kind of generically, but I really focused primarily on other large states with demographics somewhat similar to ours. So New York, Texas, Florida, but also Illinois and Ohio. And when we look at the average amount of money that districts are getting per pupil in the state, these are adjusted a little bit for costs, but not entirely. California spends a lot less than New York, and the only state that we really spend much more than is Florida. And we have higher costs in a lot of different ways than many of those other states. What that translates into is we have a lot fewer adults in our schools than other states do. We have a lot fewer teachers, counselors, nurses, all the other support personnel. And it does vary a lot across the state, but when we look at the average, that's what we see. Okay. Excuse me. So you can't read any of this, but there's a table in my technical report that I just wanted to point out, kind of enumerates all of the different formulas in these states and tries to identify kind of how the actual weights we use compare to the weights in other states. And so the table itself goes through all the things that were on this list, and tries to pinpoint what's the actual number, right? So we have a weight in the LCFF for need of 0.2. So we give 20% more to students who fall into our need categories. And that's a little bit on the low side compared to the weights for poverty in other states, but not dramatically so. And with the concentration weight, the average amount that districts in California are getting for their low-income students is closer to 0.3, which is right around what the average in the literature on adequacy finds is necessary. So like I said, the literature tends to be sparse for a lot of these other categories of costs. One of the things I do like to point out is that one thing that is different about California relative to Florida, New York, and Texas is that we have no adjustment either in or outside our formula for higher labor costs or geographic variation in labor costs. And the other three largest states, New York, Texas, and Florida, all do that. And they do it by accounting for variation in comparable wages. So in areas where doctors and nurses and other highly educated professionals are paid more, those districts get more because they presumably need to pay more to attract and retain good teachers. I'm trying to think what else I wanted to say about that. I can talk more about any of these specific categories, but I think in general the big takeaway is that our formula now is fairly simple. One could argue that it might be too simple. We do have some of these categories accounted for outside of the formula, and other states roll them in. So special education was kept completely outside of the LCFF. That has its own associated problems. I believe there was a different PACE seminar on special ed, right? But in a lot of other states, they roll that into the weighted formula by having weights for different categories of disability. There are other things that we have, like the necessary small schools adjustment that's outside of the formula. So some of these things are accounted for in our system just outside of the formula, and so it's a little harder to compare. So I think these days, more importantly, people are asking, well, if we want to find more money for our schools, where is that money going to come from? And so there are a couple of different ways that we can think about allocating funding to just where the source of the money for our schools. So all of the adequacy literature says districts with certain characteristics need X amount of money. There's a whole separate literature looking at how that X breaks down between funding at the local level and funding that is coming from the state. A lot of the formulas are used to make that determination where the share of state aid is coming from are based around equity. So a lot of those formulas have been developed to address equity concerns that largely came out of a whole bunch of court cases and that sort of thing. But probably not surprising to anybody here, in most states, the vast majority of local revenue comes from property taxes. That's true in California as well. That is the main source of our local funding. But because of Prop 13, our local property tax revenue is limited in ways that other states don't have. So in other states, when a local district wants to raise additional revenue, most states, they can choose locally to simply tax themselves more. And that additional revenue may or may not be offset by state aid in districts that don't have the same property values. But if a local district wants to do that, they have that option. In California, we obviously don't have that option. And so people have talked a lot about other alternatives. One alternative that is used in other states as well is sales taxes. That gets really complicated because those need to be levied at the county level and would still be subject to the same 2/3 vote majority. I believe the only district or city, county in the state that has successfully passed a sales tax for the purpose of school revenue is San Francisco. And that's obviously a little bit unique as a city, county, and district. Private donations, private contributions, everyone also has that option. In California, we have the parcel tax, which is actually unique to California. There's no other state where school districts use parcel taxes, partly because they don't need to, because they can simply raise the levy on property values instead of parcels. One option that is used in a couple of states that we haven't seen in California is local income taxes. That would face the same kind of complexities as sales taxes, and in addition is considered a really volatile tax base, and so is not really ideal, but it is an option that's out there. More importantly, from my perspective, any of these options carries implications for equity and is going to interact with things that are going on at the state level. In particular, Prop 98. It is really difficult to predict what any policy change that allows local districts more flexibility to raise revenue locally. It's really hard to predict how those kind of policy changes will actually affect district revenue because of how it will interact with Prop 98. Under Test 2 and 3, increases in local property revenue don't necessarily increase revenue available to districts. It simply reduces the obligation of the state. So the actual allocation to districts might not change at all, even if districts can have more money locally. It's not true under Test 1, and so again, it depends on where we're at in any particular year. Another thing to consider is that if we allow districts more flexibility in raising money through local property taxes, we still have the constraints of Serrano v. Priest, which say that per pupil district revenue cannot be too correlated with local property wealth. So for example, if in some alternative universe, every district had their LCFF allocation covered by their local property taxes and then some, right? So if every district was essentially a basic aid district, the amount over the LCFF allocation would be determined largely by the local property tax base. And in that case, we could run into problems with the Serrano v. Priest ruling, which says you can't have those kinds of correlations and the state has to make additional adjustments. And then finally, the one thing I like to point out to people, because people seem really unaware of it, as we think about options for raising additional revenue at the local level, and I'm thinking in particular right now about the split roll proposal that would sort of loosen the Prop 13 restrictions on business property. That would lead to additional property tax revenue at the local level. But $1 of additional property tax revenue in any county is allocated across multiple entities, right? Some goes to the county, some goes to the city, some goes to the school districts, and some goes to other agencies. The share across counties for those various entities varies dramatically. So in any given county, the percentage of an additional $1 of property tax revenue that goes to schools can vary from 30% up to 60-something%. And that's based on history and AB 8 and the various legislative policies over the years that have adjusted for changes in the amount of revenue that's available. And so again, it's very difficult to say for any given district if local property revenue goes up, how much individual districts are likely to get. And so I'm going to end there. I said I would go through this fairly quickly to leave as much time as possible for the discussion about how much we actually need. So I'm going to turn it over to Ileana.
Thank you. It's super exciting to be here. So now we're going to discuss the other part. So we really try to see, okay, what will it cost to California to really provide an adequate education to all students? Here we are. So what comes, like, how does the adequacy study start? Where do they come from? And then there's two fundamental questions that every adequacy study wants to address. So one is like, what is the cost of providing an adequate educational opportunity to all students? And then how are these resources gonna be distributed so that there is an equitable educational opportunity to all students, regardless of what are their needs or what are their circumstances. So some of these studies come because there's a litigation, like the case in New York and Kansas, or they come because the state legislatures want to be very proactive, as the case of New Mexico. And the third reason is like the researchers are being proactive and they want to give evidence to the coming legislature, as is this case of California. So what are the different methods? One is like the input-oriented, where we look at all the ingredients that are needed, so the staffing, the books, the materials, to get at that goal of providing an adequate education. So it's evidence-based, and we do through professional judgment panels. We bring in educators and ask them to design the program and specify the resources. The other method is like the outcome-oriented approaches. So they look at what is the spending right now and how is that correlated to the student outcomes. And they also look at successful schools. So what are the schools, what are they doing, and why are they being successful? And the three main things that this study look for is like, okay, what are the student needs? What are the scale of operations, whether, small, large, because when you have very large schools, you can take advantage of economies of scale, and then the price level inputs, because as you know, like it depends if you're in Yolo County, whereas you're in San Francisco, the cost of living and the teacher salaries are very different. So what did we do here in getting down to facts? So our main research question, as I said, was, okay, what is the cost of providing all students in California an adequate education? And then what are the resources they need, and how much it would cost? So first we had to define what were the goal statement. So this is, what is an adequate education? So what we did, we said, okay, California accountability system has defined the matrix, where you want all schools to be in the green area in different indicators, in suspension rate, English learner progress, graduation rate, and academic, because they want that every kid achieves the grade level in English language arts or literacy. The other thing that we also said is based on the school Board of Education. It's not only like English language arts and mathematics, but all the other subjects that are offered at the various schooling levels. So how did we start it? First, we did the goal statement. Then we asked researchers and practitioners to write 5 different briefs. One was about at-risk students. The other one was about English learners. Then one about special education, and the other one was about rural education and successful program schools. So these briefs were handed to the professional judgment panels to give them, this is the evidence, this is what the literature says in regarding to these topics, and to address the needs of the students. The way we convene the professional judgment panels is we ask for nominations across all the state in California, and we emailed and called district and county level superintendents. We reached out to California Teacher Association, to First 5. We also looked at the list of the teachers and principals who had won the best teacher or principal award. And so we asked them to nominate outstanding educators. And then once we had these nominations, before that we had a a rubric where we gave them additional points if they had a higher degree in education, if they were very experienced, if they had any experience about school finance. And we wanted, the second step was to ensure that these panels were balanced, that we had like the same number sort of male and females, that they were representing rural and urban districts, and they were also from mixed race. So we handed them homework, we gave them the goal statement and their little briefs, and then we convened them. There were two panels, one in Northern California and the other in Southern California. There were 11 panelists, one teacher for each schooling level, one principal also for one schooling level. Then we have an early childhood specialist, an English language learner specialist, a special education specialist, a superintendent, and a school business official. And so we sat them in the room for 3 days, and then we had really rich conversations. From there, we took out the adequate school level program. So they designed, then we costed out at the schooling level. Then we estimated the district cost, all the administrative, the overhead, transportation, ancillary, and then we aggregated them to estimate a cost at California level, and then at the schooling level and at the district level. And the last thing that we did is we compared, okay, this is the cost to achieve an adequate education, and how much is California really spending? So in the panel workshops, like, panelists really have to have in mind, like, they have to support students regardless of their needs and to provide excellence in education, like services. So, but we didn't want them to just tell us, oh, this is the golden ticket, fly me to the moon. We really want them to say, hey, these designs and resources that you're asking, they have to be realistic. So we said they have to deliver the goals, they have to be supported by evidence-based approaches, they have to be efficient, and they have to be realistic. Because if not, like, it's very hard to believe like what the professional judgment panels, what is the result of them. So then, as I said before, we gave them the goal statement, the briefs, and then we also gave them the school level resource profiles of the typical school so that they had some idea of what was going on average across the schools in California. So this is the different tasks that we gave the panelists. So the first task was to design the program for a typical school with the typical number of English language learners, special education students, and we really asked them, okay, think about what do you want? And then is it an push in, push out system? Is it like, what are we gonna do with counselors? How many APs do you want? How many aides? What is the size of the classroom? The teacher ratio, how long should the school year be? How long the school day? Is it 7 hours, 8 hours? Do we want to provide supports for summer or after school? So all the different supports that school can give, that we were asked them to say, okay, think about what the student needs, and then how are we gonna best serve them? So from there, they had this huge Excel file where we had line by line different, each of the different ingredients that we were talking about. Then once they designed the typical school, we said, okay, now think, what if this school had a larger proportion of students in poverty? How would you change the program? What additional supports are needed? Then the third one was, okay, now you have this school with a high level of poverty, but what happens if it's a school that also has a higher level of English language learners? And then here the discussion also focused on, okay, what services we can provide to the parents, because they were discussing, oh, we have these all immigrant students and that their parents come and they don't know anything, so what can we say? And they were very good discussions about having bilingual educators and all the rest of the supports. Then we went back to say, okay, the typical school, and now we varied the special education. What if this school had a very high proportion of students that needed special education. And so also here with the special education specialists, we were deciding, okay, what is the ratio? How many aides or teachers do you need? Do you want the students to be inclusive, or do you want them to go out? So it was really nice. Then we did the district level special education ancillary services to say, okay, what are the specific resources that we need to provide for special education? And then the task 5 was, okay, like now think about a small school. It can be in rural area, but think mostly about small school. What can you do? Because, you know, you cannot have all these different catalog of courses in high school where you have the electives. In a small school, like there's a lower number of students, there's less teachers, so what can they really do to be, to provide a good education? And the last task was to determine the programmatic priorities. So what that means, it was very interesting. We told them, okay, you have your program design. This is what you said would be the resources you need to achieve this education. What happens if there's a budget cost? What happens if there's like 10% less resources? What are you gonna do? What are the changes that you're gonna make so that you still provide the supports needed to achieve the adequate education, but you have less money? So there were many discussions, and they really said, no, the teacher-student ratio has to be the same. We're gonna cut, for example, they said summer education, and school, after school, but we want the supports, the teachers, the counselors to stay the same. So one of the, I'm just gonna present a couple of the features and what we were discussing, the consensus. So that it was very important for them to find spaces so that teachers would collaborate. So they were saying, okay, let's put all the kids of one grade into PE so that we can sit down and talk about the plans, what we need to do. Keep class sizes small, but not so small to be inefficient. Then they really wanted to provide additional supports for STEM or for arts. They were very interested in providing school to 4-year-olds and to TK. And they wanted to engage families in meaningful ways so that they could help the kids thrive in school. They also said, okay, for the special education, it has to be inclusive and has to have sufficient staffing levels. Then they said, well, we have to support dual language learners. We have to have bilingual educators. The training has to be intentional. The professional development has to be linked to evaluation and feedback systems, and also to acknowledge the diversity of the student body and see how they can provide the support to differentiate the services that was needed. The last 2 components, one was about social emotional development. They said, okay, it needs to be integrated in the school. And there needs, the last thing that it was very interesting that they were saying, it was about vertical alignment, so that the curriculum and the instruction align not only across grades, but also vertically. They wanted to say, oh, we need to talk to the TK teachers, that they talk to the kindergartner teachers and the first graders so that the transition is much more smoother. And so I think I've talked about that. So I think now Jesse can tell you about all the findings. Okay.
Thanks, Ileana. Okay, I'm gonna go up here because I've got some numbers that I gotta to look at. So I think Ileana set this up pretty well. I wanted to give you sort of a sneak preview of the key findings that we're going to talk about later on. The first is, and it might be no surprise to anybody, but we've actually put some fairly rigorous analysis to this, that California needs to spend more money in order to provide an adequate educational opportunity to all of its students. The second is that the estimated gap between what's necessary to provide an adequate education in terms of cost and what's actually being spent is larger in more highly impoverished districts and also in more relatively rural districts, okay? And then finally, the last key finding, and we're going to go into all of these, is the numbers that I'm going to show you might give you some sticker shock. But in reality, we come to the conclusion that it's not saying so much about how large these numbers are. It's saying more about how little we spend relative to other states. And I'm going to show you some hard figures on that. So here's the first key result for you. So what you're looking at here on the left column is our actual spending that we calculated here. And actually, this is even smaller on this screen than up here. So I'm going to go over here. We calculated that operational spending on California schools on average, and these are all 16-17 school year figures, was about $12,204 per student. We calculated that California would have to spend approximately 38% more in order to provide an adequate educational opportunity to all of its students. That in per pupil terms, it's a $16,890 price tag, if you will. And so that's the sticker shock that I was going to hit you with here. If we break it out into quartiles of poverty, so what you're looking at here are the quartiles of poverty, where 1 is the lowest poverty and quartile 4 is the highest poverty. We can do a comparison of the orange bars, which are the actual per pupil spending on average in those district categories, and the blue bars are what we've calculated as the projected adequate cost. And then we have the nice curly brackets that show the distance that you have to make up in order to provide an adequate educational opportunity to students in these different district categories. And as we see, in the highest poverty districts, that gap is about 46%. In other words, we calculated that the highest poverty districts are spending about $13,400 per student, whereas it would cost about $19,568 to provide an adequate opportunity there. That's a 46% relative difference. If we go down to the, I don't know if there's a pointer on this thing. Anyway, if we go down to the lowest poverty districts, we see that the gap is about 22%. All right? So we also looked at this with respect to district locale. And so this is getting at that second key finding. And over on the rightmost, you have the rural districts, and then we have the small towns, suburbs, and on the leftmost pair of columns, you have the city districts. And what we find is that the rural and the small towns tend to have much larger relative gaps in funding. That is the relative difference between what is necessary to provide an adequate educational opportunity and what they're actually spending is larger. So it's about 46% in rural areas, 52% in small towns, and when you get down to the cities, it's still sizable. But for cities and suburbs, it's about 37% and 38%, okay? Now, people might walk away from this and say, oh, we're going to have to spend a whole lot more money on the rural and the towns than we are in the cities and suburbs. And in relative terms, yes, you have to spend more, but there are so few students in those districts that it would not cost a lot to bring the rural districts and the small towns up. So let me just give you, this is the total cost by district locale, okay? And these are in billions of dollars. Probably can't read that, but so what we have, again, on the left-hand side of the graphic here are cities, it goes suburbs, towns, and rurals. The baby blue portions of each bar is what we call the marginal adequacy cost. That's the additional dollars you would have to spend to bring all students up to provide an adequate opportunity to all students. And what you see is in the towns and rural, the sum of the baby blue bars is about $3.1 billion. The total amount of the baby blue bars is like 26 billion, okay? So while, I think if we go back, the findings are saying that in relative terms, the rural districts have more need, or they've been traditionally more underfunded, okay, is what that's saying. But across the board, everybody needs more funding in order to be brought up to an adequate level of education. And obviously, most of our student population is really in cities and suburbs. So it's going to cost quite a bit more, about $11.6 billion to bring city districts up, and about $11 billion for suburbs. Okay. So we also wanted to do a little statistical analysis to look at how the relationships between these student needs factors and other cost factors related to our predicted costs, and compare that to how they relate to the actual spending. So, and that's what this is. I don't expect anybody to read all of these numbers here, but one of the takeaways that we came to is that the estimated relationship between student poverty and our predicted adequate dollars was higher than what the actual relationship is under LCFF. Okay, so it's basically saying that our LCFF poverty weight is not aggressive enough. That's the bottom line here. All right. And it's interesting because Professor Imazeki sort of said, well, we've got this funding weight that's on average about 0.3, and that's sort of on average, but there are a lot of other states, I think, that some other states that are higher. If you look at the adequacy studies, it depends on what type of study it is. The cost function studies tend to be lower, around that 0.3, and then the professional judgment studies, as this one, have poverty weights that are somewhat higher. We also wanted to do a little bit of analysis because remember how we came up with these numbers. We brought expert educators together in 3-day workshops, and we asked them to build school-level designs from the bottom up. And we said, listen, we want you to make efficient specifications with respect to all the different resources you're going to need. And then we worked a little bit of magic and showed how these projected dollars varied by different student needs, okay? But we also want to do a little bit of verification and make sure, do our projections have a relationship to outcomes, okay? Before, remember the professional judgment panel said, here's a goal statement. You have to have all of your kids, all of your kids or students, give them the opportunity to meet the California achievement and content standards. So in the green or above on the 5x5 matrix. This is sort of a test to see if the specific specifications they came up with produced costs that had the relationship you would expect with respect to achievement. What we have on the y-axis here, this is a plot of all of the districts in the state, okay? And on the y-axis, we have the average grade 3 through 8 math and ELA achievement on the SBAC. All right, so that's really what we would call the level metric in our dashboard. All right, and on the x-axis, we have what we call the adequacy gap. So it's centered around 0, and positive numbers are the percent difference between what we projected as an adequate cost and what a district is actually spending. So if you had, if it was, if it was 0.25 or actually 25 on this, it would mean that you are spending 25% less than what you need to provide an adequate education. So everything to the right of that vertical dashed line, those are districts that have a gap between adequate cost and what they're actually spending. To the left are those relatively few districts that have less, have more than what they actually need to provide an adequate educational opportunity. And we fit a nice little line here, and we see that there's a very strong negative, it's negatively sloped. So there's a negative relationship between your relative need for funding, the gap in funding, and how well your students are doing. And we also wanted to look at that 0 point, that's where a district has just what our model says they need to provide an adequate education. And then we go over and we see what achievement level does that associate with? It's 23.2. So that would put a district in the high level category, okay? So we see this as a validation that, hey, our model is actually targeting money where it's needed with respect to outcomes, okay? At least, I mean, not every outcome, but This is just looking at standardized student achievement. So remember that I had this key finding talking about, okay, what do we do with this large number? We're saying, wow, 38%, that's a lot, you know? We're only spending, you know, a little over $12,200 per kid, and, you know, Dr. Levin, you're telling me we have to spend $16,890 per student. That's a pretty big price tag. We wanted to look at this and benchmark it against what other states were currently spending. So this is a comparison of what we were currently spending in 2016-17, what we have projected we would need to spend to achieve our state's goals, that is to provide an adequate education to all students, and what other states were currently spending in that same year, okay? And so our projections are only 2% less than what Massachusetts was currently spending in that same year, 15% less than Vermont, 16% less than New Jersey, 17% less than Connecticut, and whoa, New York, 28%, okay? I'm not saying that all of these other states are spending their money perfectly efficiently, okay? But we tend to hear very, very good things about Massachusetts, right? So this gives you some idea that it's not really that, that the $16,890 is so much. It's that we're currently spending so little. So I want to give you a couple reasons why this measure, this 16,890, might actually be a lower bound of what we have to spend. So the first reason is that everybody knows there's more or less of a pension crisis, and much of the burden is increasingly being placed on districts to make up the gap to keep the fund solvent. So the second is that if we're talking about increasing funding by 38%, well, a lot of that money would be used to hire new staff, right? So there could be some knock-on effects there. We already have a teacher shortage, and there could be some labor market effects there that would cost more. Finally, if we wanted to implement a policy, all of a sudden money came down from heaven, and we wanted to implement this, we would have to implement it with a hold harmless. That is, there were some of those districts on that scatter plot that were currently spending more than our model said they have to spend to provide an adequate education. You would not want to cut their funding, right? I mean, it would be political suicide to do so anyway, but you also don't want to just say, you know, district, we're taking funding away from you cold turkey. If anything, you'd want to phase that out over time, but there's a cost to that. That is, you know, our projections are based on every district getting exactly what they were projected. But in reality, if you wanted to implement that, you'd have to provide a soft landing or hold those potential loser districts harmless. So recap of the findings, and then I'll be done. In 16-17, we were spending about $66.7 billion. We would have to spend an additional $25.6 billion annually, or a 38% increase, in order to provide an adequate educational opportunity to all students. The gap is noticeably larger in districts with higher poverty and also more rural districts. And while this suggested increase seems really large, when you compare it to other districts that, you know, you can argue we're trying to compete with, quite frankly, it actually is not that large. And that's it. Those are our names. Thank you. Was that okay? Yeah.
Ooh. Thanks, Dollar. So I'm going to ask the presenters to come up to the front. We'll open it up to question and answer, but then you can all be up there. Okay. So questions, comments, reflections?
So,
oh. I'm sorry. My mic off.
oh darn, because this is a question for you, Dr. Levin. Jennifer Bester from Educate Our State. You used cities, towns, rural areas, suburbs as your geographical constraints or whatever. You looked at things not by counties or metropolitan areas, but rather by cities, towns, and so forth. Why did you do that, particularly in light of, for example, Dr. Kirst's original LCFF blueprint 10 years ago, looked at counties and comparative wage indices and so forth? Why did you switch to a different construct?
So let me answer your question first. All of the figures that you just saw there were cost adjusted using the CWI. Okay, so for presentation purposes and analysis purposes, we simply just broke it out by the NCS locale codes to do that. We could break it out by, if we wanted to typify counties in any way, we could have broken it out by that as well. This was just a simple way to break it out. And we could have done it more granularly according to locale codes, because within each of those 4 categories, there are 3 subcategories, right, in there. But I think to answer your question, just because we didn't show you the effects of cost adjusting by geographic area, using Lori Taylor's comparable wage index is what we used, right? That is baked into all of these numbers. Is that helpful? Okay.
Thank you. Hugh Lingley, Parkhurst. Follow up to that question. We generally know that urban school districts have higher concentrations of poverty, and rural districts tend to have less. Well, is there a reason why you actually decide to group those 2 categories together?
In what way do you
No,
mean?
not rural. Suburbs. So cities and suburbs. There's income disparities generally between those areas, but in lumping them together, I wonder if that actually diluted that effect.
So at what point are you talking about lumping them together? That's what I don't understand.
So I think when you were talking about, the 38% in cities and suburbs,
Sure.
were they the same? It's just I couldn't see through that.
I'm sorry. No, so for rural areas, it's 46%. And for smaller towns, it's 52%. And then suburbs and cities are closer together. They're split. But one just happens to be 37%, and the other one's 38%. Okay, so we're not lumping any. And again, remember, we're starting out with trying to project at the school level based on school level needs, then coming up to the district level. And this is based on the aggregated school level. We add district level costs to that, which also vary across districts. And then this is just a way to break it up. So we have a database that has every single district, and we could present this in a variety of ways. This was just the simplest.
I'm just curious how you all think we can actually get the money, right? You know, for instance, we know that the Schools and Communities First initiative is coming up in November 2020, but that will only be a very small portion of the amount that we need. So what can we do statewide to get this needed money? And then what can we do in, I'm coming from Sonoma County, which is, you know, pretty small towns that do not, you know, Sonoma County is one of the most expensive places to live in the state, but just as an example, the teacher salaries are way below the statewide average there. So the cost of living for both teachers and the students is causing, you know, decline in enrollment, teachers to leave and look for other places to work. So what can we do to, again, get the money on the statewide level, and what can we do maybe as a county to also get the, you know, some money to move forward towards this?
So I want to pass this to Jennifer, but I mean, I think she posted, she sort of had bullets of what the things that we can do here. I guess what I want to say is that if we look at how much other states are spending and the effort that they're putting in, right, in terms of how much are they spending as a percentage of their gross state product, right, it can be done, okay? It can be done. Now, if we can't do it in one fell swoop, I don't think that means we shouldn't try and start scaffolding it and doing something. You know, certainly the split ballot measure is a start, and it's not going to get us near there. I mean, I heard some numbers going around, 6 billion or something like that, but not all of that would go to education, right? But anything that we can do to start making our way there and scaffolding it, it's not going to happen overnight, that's for sure. But I want to pass it to either of you.
Well, I feel like I should try to answer this because that's part of what I was talking about today. At the same time, as Jesse pointed out, I think there are certain options. There's only a specific list of options even available in California, right? And the question is whether the political will is there to exercise any of those options. So the split roll, as Jesse pointed out, the numbers that get thrown around about how much additional revenue will be raised from that. One of the things I was trying to points I was trying to make is that amount will be split, is not all going to go to schools, right? That additional revenue will go to schools and cities and counties and all the other little districts. And it will also, we also need to think about where the additional money might come from at the state level, and that's really got to be general fund. And that really is a political will issue in my mind.
But has there been any sort of investigation of the tax structure, right? Because, for instance, I've seen, I forget what the new name is, but the Center on Budget Policy, it used to have like a chart that showed that the people at the bottom are paying more as a percentage in taxes than those at the top. And the reason we've gone up more recently is because the Prop 30 and the Prop 55 have increased funding more recently, but those are temporary, but they're still paying less than the bottom 40% of the population who have their kids in the schools, right, in the public schools. So anyway, I'm just...
Well, no, I mean, it's a good point, and I think all of us up here know less about general tax policy than about the policy specific to schools, because what you're talking about is a change in the overall tax structure. Right, and but again, that's going to increasing general fund monies. So and some portion of that would go to schools, and so the only way really to do that to get the additional money for schools is to increase the overall general fund pot. Right, and there's a variety of ways to do that have to do largely with increasing tax rates on somebody.
And just one note on Split Roll. Pace did a poll at the beginning of this year and showed differentiated support across the state, but relatively low for this point in a campaign, which is just to say that one thing that can happen on the political will front is that everyone has to work to build it. Because even though that doesn't get us all of the way there, it's not even a slam dunk yet.
I'm Naomi with the Learning Policy Institute, and I'm going to follow up on this question. I'm sure you're going to love me for staying on this topic. But Jennifer, you had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that California's options for additional revenue are limited in ways that it isn't in other states. And so my question is, what are the policy changes that have to happen in order to remove those barriers so that we can
Prop
increase
13.
revenue? That's the main one? Are there any other things?
That is the main one. I mean, prior to Prop 13, districts across California had many of the same options as in other states. We could choose to raise our own taxes locally. I mean, technically, I guess I'm not even sure. Technically, can you, even if you wanted to, with a 2/3 local vote? I'm not even actually sure if that's true. Because it's considered statewide. I think it would basically, it's pretty much Prop 13.
I had a question about, did you simulate any kind of distribution system? Like you said that LCFF adds 0.3 on for the needy students. Is that a good distribution system, but do you have any suggestions on modifying that to allocate the money to where the needs are? Or is it just a matter of increasing it overall and that distribution system would seem to hit the needs?
So the regression analysis that Jesse showed, that you couldn't possibly have seen the small little numbers, but if they're in the report, does suggest that it's actually 0.2 for low income, and it goes up to 0.5 if you're over the concentration threshold. And so when you put those two together, the average is about 0.29 across districts. And what the analysis with the professional judgment panel suggests is that that's too low. So it could be that the 0.2 needs to be higher. It could be that it's really the concentration threshold or the concentration weight. Right, but your point is that if I understand your results correctly, it's the highest poverty. It's the districts with the highest concentrations of poverty that have the biggest gaps, right? And so increasing the weight that we give for the high concentration poverty districts, right? Which would which would also help some of the rural districts who often have high levels of poverty as well. But we don't have anything in or outside of the LCFF that would target money directly at those rural districts. The necessary small schools supplement is really the only thing that gets at size, and it's clearly not sufficient.
So the only thing that I want to add to that is that if clearly we don't have a geographic cost of education adjustment, right, here in the state, and which is kind of a shame because the costs of hiring and retaining qualified staff runs the gamut. I mean, there's a huge range across the state. If we did want to introduce that, then you want to also make sure that these sparsity adjustments or rurality adjustments are also really there because they kind of offset each other in more rural areas. So when you're trying to put together a comprehensive formula, you want to cover all of your bases. So I know that there's a lot of interest in putting in a geographic cost of education index. And that's good, but we also want to make sure that our small district adjustment is there as well, because the more rural areas will tend to have lower index values on a geographic cost of education, and you also want to realize that that's one factor, but the other factor is the economies of scale, and if they're operating on lower economies of scale, they should get a boost in their funding. So I think that our results do say that the average, what I'm going to say, the average implicit weight for an impoverished student or a socioeconomically disadvantaged student is a bit low here. We have a pretty high number there. It's more like 0.8 in our regression. I'm not going to say that we should trust that, but it's pure indication that it should be higher than where it is. And I think that you're right that we should bump up what that weight is for the concentration. So.
Last question here.
Well, I'd like to reinforce the idea that it's actually going to take all oars in the water to get to anything near adequate funding. But Professor Imazeki, you mentioned the challenge of allocation percentages. So Prop 13, and again, we're a statewide parent group, so we collect information all the way across the state. Prop 13 was necessary but not sufficient to ruin California school funding. It was actually the AB8 allocation a year later that did it. And when you said between 30 and 60% of property taxes go to schools, that's accurate but not actually correct in terms of particularly the initiative, the proposition we're talking about, because there only 9% is going into schools from San Francisco, because San Francisco's allocation factor to schools is only 9%. Los Angeles and Alameda counties are both around 23, a little less than 23%. And so, in fact, there's less than a third of the new revenue that's collected will actually go to schools and community colleges, about 33%. If anybody would like to see our data, I would be happy to show it, but it has been heartbreaking for us to realize that. So we're going to need all oars in the water, be it the general fund, sales taxes. I believe there's a parcel tax, drop in the parcel tax requirement. All of those things are going to be necessary to get anywhere near these numbers.
I do want to talk to you about the data, because one of the things I'm actually trying to do is figure out. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what that percentage is, because of the percentage that's for example, reported by, I think it's the Board of Equalization, is not quite right because it doesn't include different things that get allocated down at the county level. And so, yeah, I just want to point that out. And I also want to point out that again, anytime we start talking about raising additional revenue at the local level, we also need to be thinking about it at the state level, because it will interact with Prop 98, and there may be equity issues that arise. Things like parcel taxes are a good example. Even if every district across the state, were to levy a parcel tax, that would have implications for equity, the distribution from an equity perspective that the state may need to step in to address.
Thank you so much to the presenters and to all of you for coming today to learn with us. We look forward to continuing the conversation.